Hi everyone, my name is Jennifer Lee, and I'm a program manager at Microsoft working on Azure Compute. So it's actually funny because Frank and I were just talking about how quickly all the Azure services have grown so far. So I was actually thinking about the date that I got my offer letter for Microsoft. I think actually only like half of these services or features even existed at that time. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a frame of reference in terms of how quickly this ecosystem is growing. So basically today, my goal for this presentation is to kind of give you a brief overview as to what the cool and exciting latest updates we have in terms of announcements for Azure Compute, focusing especially on the application platform side of the world. So that revolves around web apps, Kubernetes, containers, serverless. So a lot of the really cool things that are now services we offer on top of VMs. So that's goal number one. And then goal number two is also kind of to give you a more insider look in terms of how Microsoft is thinking about all the different trends that we see in cloud computing. I feel like that's really interesting for startups, so you can plan ahead. You can kind of think of what you can, if you're not in the cloud space yourself, you can think about what features and what products to use so you can set yourself up for success in the future. And if you are in the cloud space, then you can kind of see what we're going after for our own customers to be able to potentially ride on Microsoft's coattails. And I'm sure Frank has more details on co-selling and partnership opportunities. So you can take a picture of this. Feel free to email me or reach out to me on Twitter after the presentation if you have follow-up questions. Oh, okay, great. Yes. All right, well, this is pretty obvious, but basically Azure as the world's computer. So the idea is that if you aren't familiar with Azure, it is the cloud computing division at Microsoft that basically allows you to deploy and use a whole series of different services from our cloud computing services, Azure Stack, which is our on-premise play, as well as a lot of Internet of Things and Edge services as well. But basically the point of it is that there are a lot of different services, and I'll dive deep into several of these. So this is kind of the scale in terms of what we're looking at in terms of the Azure platform. It's really has grown much, like very well over the years, and that has kind of been seen in terms of our customer adoption with a lot of different types of companies, big Fortune 500 companies, all the way down to startups that have onboarded to the platform over time. All right, so basically the purpose of this particular slide is I wanted to talk about how many regions we have. So basically on-demand scale, that's a huge thing. We actually are in more regions than any other cloud provider. So someone just told me, one of my colleagues just told me that we literally just had to update the slide because we announced a new data center in Israel. So just kind of making sure that wherever you need to reach your customers, you can use our Azure Compute services there with as many different VM size options as we have, as well as the serverless containerized services as well on top of it. Secondly, best for Microsoft workloads. So what we want to do is that we have best for Microsoft workloads, as well as also our us embracing Linux, open source, basically all the things that we have that people are using. So you kind of get the best of both worlds, where if you're a traditional Microsoft shop, you're in good hands on our services. But if you're running on Linux, you're using open source, you're trying to like piece together all these different things, 50% of our Azure VMs actually run Linux. So you kind of see that customer adoption of Linux, and we want to meet our customers where they are. That's really important to us. So if you have a Microsoft workload, .NET, so on and so forth, that's awesome. They'll always be great at Microsoft. But if you're running Linux, you're used to using No Machine on Ubuntu, like all of that is going to be very native to you on our services. And then here I kind of want to talk a little bit about security compliance. So a lot of the great things about Microsoft is that we have to deal with all different types of Fortune 500 companies who need like you can imagine, like big insurance companies, healthcare companies, financial companies that need security and compliance. So this kind of gives you a brief overview. We have dedicated security teams. We have basically invested $1 billion into cybersecurity to make sure that Microsoft and our customers are safe when they're running on our cloud. And then in addition to that, we also have over 90 compliance offerings. So basically, if you need compliance, you are a startup in healthcare, fintech, insurance, so on and so forth, those who need to have a little bit more stringency there, we have the services for you. All right, so moving on to what I wanted to talk about in terms of the services I want to highlight. So first of all, I kind of want to start off by kind of giving a lay of the land in terms of how computing has evolved over time. So, well, even though a lot of customers still do this, we first started out with people having their own servers. So this would be what people call on-premise. So basically, you would have a server room in the back that would be really hot or really cold, depending on how popular your service was, and you would have to manage that all yourself. So that was really high cost, really not that great for innovation and for startups because you have to buy these huge machines. You don't really know how to estimate capacity, all these different types of issues, in addition to all the management operations that you have to do to take care of these finicky servers that were either running hot or too cold. So from there, the world kind of moved into virtual machines or VMs. So the idea was that you have the centralized cloud providers, so Azure being one of them, AWS, GCP, so on and so forth, where instead of having your own servers, you would basically have your own virtual machine in the cloud. So the idea is that you technically own this virtual machine in the cloud. You can put whatever you want on it. You can patch it, you can update it, but at the same time, you also need to hire people to patch it and update it and operate those virtual machines, even though they're hosted in the cloud. So while you didn't need to buy the physical hardware anymore and it moved into software virtualization, you still had to have kind of high operations costs. You had to hire IT ops, so on and so forth. And yes, I definitely know that a lot of people are still on premise, and VMs is basically one of our big money makers on Azure. So definitely, if it's a solution for you, stay there and work on it. But for those who kind of wanted to be more productive, to be able to save costs, and also leverage some of the goodness that we have built on top of VMs just from our own internal Azure learnings, we moved into what we called this like app modernization movement. So this is this blue square over here. And this consists of a lot of different types of new architecture that we've seen customers use for their applications. So previously, a lot of customers just had monolithic applications, which is basically when you kind of build your whole app all together in one piece. So that was really great in certain ways, but it was not so great because if you had a monolithic application, if one piece of that broke, you would basically have like someone on your team or someone developer work on it and fix it, and then you would have to figure out how to deploy that whole thing again. So you can imagine it wasn't very modular. It wasn't really great for having different teams own different pieces. If one thing broke, it could mean that your entire application went down, and that was very mission critical, and you would basically be losing business over it. So what people move towards is this microservice architecture. So for those of you who don't know what that means, it basically breaks down the monolithic type of app architecture where you would actually have different pieces owned by different people, by different teams in your company. And for example, if you're an e-commerce company, maybe someone owned the back-end inventory system, and that was like one piece. But and then someone owned the recommendation that you would send sales to your customers, and that was another piece. People have different modular pieces, and they would all talk to each other, and that's kind of how people kind of were able to build faster, operate more efficiently. And the kind of coinciding piece that kind of helped out with that in cloud computing is that each piece people start to containerize them. So that's kind of the age that we're in now. Containers are like this huge buzzword now where people just really want to be able to package their piece of the application into this ready to run package, which is basically what a container is, into these modular systems. So you basically have little like microservice architecture where your team will own a piece of it, you would have it containerized, and if you have a new update, you just push your container out, and if anything breaks, it kind of stays contained within that part of your application. So as we moved on to these microservice architectures, that's kind of how it came to be. And that's where also another new buzzword called Kubernetes. So how many of you have heard of containers, first of all? Okay, great. How many of you have heard of Kubernetes? Oh, awesome. Well, it is definitely at the peak of the hype cycle now. So basically, that kind of evolved from the fact that people were using microservices. You can have Kubernetes, which is a container orchestrator, orchestrate all the different pieces of the containers together to make sure they're talking to each other and consuming the underlying compute power as a result. And then moving off of that, we have serverless. So for those who are developers at heart and don't really want to worry about infrastructure at all, don't want to pick their VM sizes, they just want to have pieces of code that they want to run, that is kind of what serverless is offering. Basically, the idea is that you have quote unquote infinite scale and you don't have to worry about the compute costs and you just pay for what you have executed. So that's kind of the lay of land and the architecture, but how does this translate to Azure services? So in terms of Azure services, there's three I want to highlight right now, and then I'll go into specific features that we have announced recently, just basically in the past 6 months. So first of all is Azure Kubernetes Service. So it seems like most of you are familiar with Kubernetes is. So AKS, which is Azure Kubernetes Service, is Azure's managed Kubernetes offering. So basically the idea is that in Kubernetes, you have the Kubernetes masters, which control and orchestrate the different containers that I was talking about. So you get your managed Kubernetes masters at no charge and high availability. We have cluster autoscaler feature, which basically allows you for easy and sophisticated cluster scaling. So you can scale out the number of nodes or like VMs who are part of a cluster, as well as horizontal pod autoscaler, which is very much scaling out the pods or containers in your Kubernetes service. And then also, I think what makes us a really great differentiator is that we understand that if you're running on Kubernetes and you have containers, you probably have a mix of both developers and IT pros and network administrators all having to work together. And you don't want to push things directly into production. So we have a bunch of different offerings that improve and integrate the developer experience onto Kubernetes so that people can use, for example, Azure Dev Spaces to deploy their latest change into a dev environment before pushing it into production. Second product I want to highlight is Azure App Service. Well, first of all, how many of you use AKS? Okay, a little bit. How many of you used Azure App Service? Okay, awesome. So App Service is one of the easiest and most simple ways to get your web app, API app, basically any app that uses HTTP into the Azure cloud. So it's kind of built for your convenience and for your productivity. What App Service does is basically you can bring your code or bring your container on Windows or Linux and deploy that into an app service. And we take care of the underlying infrastructure. So you just basically pick like whatever SKU that you need to use in terms of like memory and storage and so on and so forth. And everything else is basically like a one-click deploy. So you can set up your auto scale rules to be triggered to adjust to demand and traffic. So if you're an e-commerce company preparing for Black Friday, you can set that up and make sure your customers don't go down when they're trying to purchase their holiday shopping. And there's also a breadth and depth of productivity features for app service as well. So basically, it's super easy. 60 seconds, you can get your web app into app service. And in addition to that, we have different easy ways for you to set up deployment slots or testing in production, and even a intelligent diagnostics experience. Because we understand it's great to have 60 seconds to wow, you get your web app in there and it's up and running. But what happens on day 2, day 3, when you're running in production and your customers are having issues and you don't know what's wrong with your application? It could be something that you wrote in your own code. It could be the platform itself or something you misconfigured. So we actually added a layer of intelligent diagnostics on top of app service to kind of help you out with that. All right, the third service I want to highlight is Azure Functions. How many of you use Functions? Okay, great. So Functions is our serverless functions offering. So if you think about the comparable in AWS, it's Lambda, and at GCP is Google Cloud Run. And Functions basically allows you to accelerate your app development even further by giving you a great programming model that allows you to execute pieces of code and you pay per execution. So the idea is that you might not want to have a huge VM that just processes different trigger-based events. So this allows you the serverless compute where you only pay for execution. If you need it to run hot and then running through and executing your piece of code when you need it to be, you can, but if not, you're not paying for it at all. So this uses several built-in triggers. You can trigger it based on HTTP, based on a scheduled time, or based on a bunch of different logic apps that we can have. So a lot of people set this up by using like Twilio and have that trigger some piece of code that they use that in the in-between to be able to trigger something else. So basically, there's hundreds of different triggers that you can use out of the box. And also, in addition to that, this is really great as a developer option. It's a great programming model where we have VS Code integration allowing you to test and code up your function in whatever and debug, as well as in anything in terms of your preferred editor or browser. And also, I think what's really great, especially for startups, is that you actually can run 1 million function executions for free with the kind of the model that we have in terms of what we give for you for free until you actually have to start paying per execution and paying for gigabytes per second. All right, so now we're kind of moving into announcements. So there's a lot of text here. I won't go through it all, but when I was talking about the themes that we're thinking about at Azure Compute, there are a couple of ones that I want to highlight. So one is containers everywhere. So each of the 3 different products that I highlighted all have container offerings. So the idea is that if you have containerized your application, you can really use it and like anywhere. You can put it in a Azure Kubernetes cluster, you can throw it into a web app on app service, or you can actually containerize a function and use that in Azure Functions as well. So there's containers everywhere, and more people are adopting not only Linux containers, but also Windows containers as well. So this has been a trend that we've seen our customers adopt, and also a trend that we're working on in terms of Azure to make sure that we're helping our customers who are using containers on our offerings basically operate more efficiently. So this is some of the announcements that we've had in that space. So you can see some of the Windows container support. You can see Azure Dev Spaces that allows people to basically test and deploy their containers onto AKS more efficiently, so on and so forth. The second is secure workloads. So they're in each of the 3 different services that I was talking about. We wanted to make sure that customers were able to, for example, apply different policies. So we understand that it's not just you working on your application. It might be for now, but if you have a big team, how do you actually figure out who has permissions to what, who can deploy into production, who cannot, who has different access to the network layer, have different access to the compute layer, so on and so forth. And that is a super important feature as we've seen companies with big teams kind of grow. So that, for example, has we announced support for that for AKS to be able to allow you to do that. Secondly is also when people want to deploy into a virtual network. So if you want to use firewalls, block traffic, IP whitelisting, those types of features are available in our services as well. So one of the more recent announcements is that App Service on Linux supports VNet integration. So you can lock down access to your app even more easily than you did before. Third is us embracing open source. So there is a lot of things that we do where our Azure services allows you to leverage open source well, but we also have made our own contributions to the open source community. So this, for example, would include virtual nodes or virtual kubelet and Kata, which are both related to Kubernetes that we actually had Microsoft Azure developers develop into a community project that we work in collaboration with all these other companies that are building that as well. So this is kind of like a sample of the different trends that we've seen, especially helpful probably for those who are in the cloud space, kind of thinking through what their customers are looking for. But if not, this is also really cool in terms of maybe where you can set up your compute services for success in the future. All right, so I'm going to go through several of the features that I talked about. So I'll go through basically one per service that I think is super interesting and end off with our latest announcements that Frank brought up called Azure Arc at the end. So first, in terms of AKS, what I think is really cool is AKS Virtual Nodes. So what I mentioned before is that Virtual Nodes is actually the Azure implementation of this open source project called Virtual Kubelet that we actually helped build and that we donated to the cloud native compute community. So virtual nodes allows you, when you have a Azure Kubernetes cluster, to be able to first scale into what we call Azure Container Instances. The idea is that you have your AKS cluster that's running, and you can basically hook up virtual nodes to allow users to rapidly scale serverlessly in your AKS cluster. So it basically allows you to have your AKS cluster that has your nodes and pods running on it, but when they need that scale very quickly and can't afford to wait for another node to pop up, or you really only needed this burst scale for a short while, virtual nodes is a really great solution for that. So you have really quick provisioning of pods, which are your containers, and you only pay per second per the execution there. So it combines the best of Azure Kubernetes service as well as what we think of serverless computing. And this is now generally available. Second is app service. So as I talked about before, containers in Linux is supported on app service, but not only that, we actually added a free Linux container tier. So it's super easy to try out your web app, API app on app service to be able to kind of get this up and running, and you can kind of switch over to our more paid and premium offerings later on. So even though the free tier technically uses shared infrastructure and you have limited memory, so make sure to check that out when you're clicking the shared tier. This is a really great way for you to deploy your WordPress site, PHP site, throw in your custom Docker container there, and to just try it out to see if the productivity features are interesting to you, to see if app service is actually going to make you more productive at your company. So this is super cool because you can try it out and then switch over to the paid premium offering really easily. And that offering allows you to have that VNet integration that I talked about to lock down your application. You can connect it to on-premise database. You can call into another Azure virtual network. It's basically the easiest way to get your container workload up and running into the Azure cloud, and you can start for free. Yeah.
If my code is already in the containers, the reason I would use this app is manage the containers.
So app service allows you, so if your app is on a container, you have to host it somewhere, right? So app service is that hosting platform. So basically if your container is in Docker Hub, you have a container image, it's honestly as easy as going to the app service create portal, come up with a name for your web app, put your image in there, and then once you click create, you get your web app name azurewebsites.net, and it's up and running. So that's kind of the speed and productivity that App Service offers you. Does that make sense? Great. So last, I have functions. So as I said earlier, this is our kind of event-driven, event-triggered code at play. So this is functions is something that we have that I told you about, that you can basically execute 1 million different function executions for free. But we actually kind of combined our open source Kubernetes projects with functions as well, because this actually allows you, so this is Kubernetes event-driven auto-scaling. So basically the thing with Kubernetes is that people have traditionally scaled their Kubernetes clusters using like CPU, so on and so forth. But what if you had different other triggers that you want to take advantage of? And functions is a really great way for you to do that. So we kind of combined both of them and created this project called Kata, and it allows you to scale from 0 based on a bunch of different triggers. So this includes Kafka, Azure Storage Queues, Service Bus. So the idea is that if you or in blob storage, so on and so forth. So if you have like a new entry into blob storage, that could be a trigger that scales your AKS cluster. And that wasn't available before. And this is now available as an open source project that you can easily leverage by using Azure Functions or AKS, or even mix and match and combine it with other clouds if you have like a multi-cloud service. All right, and lastly, we have Azure Arc. So Azure Arc is actually something that we announced at our Microsoft Ignite conference at the keynote. So this was something that we have gotten asked a lot about from customers who have multi-cloud and hybrid solutions. So if you have workloads that are on-prem or on AWS or Google Cloud and Azure, it's a lot of different places to keep in mind and trying to keep track of. So Azure Arc allows you to manage all those different services all together in one place, and allows you to kind of leverage what Azure services have, which is the Azure Resource Management that we call ARM, and kind of take that goodness across your on-prem solution as well as your other clouds. So we understand that people want a multi-cloud offering, or at least they want to have the option to. So Azure Arc basically allows you to have this management layer on-prem, on multi-cloud, and on the edge. So the idea is that you can actually apply policies, you can apply role-based access control or RBAC, all with the multi-cloud offerings as well as on-premise. So all you have to do is, let's say you have a server, all you do is deploy this Azure Arc agent, and it shows up in the Azure portal, and it shows up all in one place. So you have your AWS VMs, and then you have your Azure Kubernetes cluster, and you have your databases everywhere. It'll all show up in the same portal, and you can deploy the same policies there. You can manage it all in one place. So it allows you kind of have that governance and have that type of management layer all in one, where before you would have to manage them all separately and try to figure out how all of them connect to each other. So this is a real game changer for a lot of our customers that have multi-cloud, but also for customers who want to go into the edge, and also for customers who have stuff that's still on-prem. All right, and then lastly, I kind of want to just talk about, there's a lot of open source projects and companies that we partner up with and work with. So this is kind of to say that we are really embracing open source on Azure, and this is just a few of the ones that we contributed to, and also leverage other companies to kind of get into. So the idea is that wherever you're at, we want to meet you there. So Azure is kind of basically have embraced this this being a leader in open source, being able to contribute as well as leverage other companies to do so as well. So it's really cool to kind of see that, and you'll definitely see more from us in this space. All right, so I want to just finish up with just some links that are useful. So you've been sleeping this whole time. This is just like all you need to know if you want to take a picture of it, as well as my Twitter and email if you want to reach out to me. But basically, key takeaway from this session is check out Azure Kubernetes Service, Azure App Service, and Azure Functions. Those are the things that are built on top of the VM layer, which is super awesome on compute. So there's really great features on top in those different products that I talked about, and there's going to be even more coming. So if you want to watch out for announcements from Microsoft, there's usually big announcements around our Microsoft Build Conference as well as Microsoft Ignite. So in that May timeframe and in that September timeframe, if you check us out there, there's going to be even more features, maybe the ones that you're looking for, the ones that are missing. So thank you all so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. And now I want to open the floor if you all have any questions.
On the Azure function, I need a cheat list. On the Azure function, I'm comparing with AWS Lambda. One of my hesitation, and most of us are startups, it would make sense to directly go to AWS Lambda or Azure functions, right? But I'm also afraid of the tie-in. When we start using those functions, then we are like very coupled with Azure. So would it be better for us to go more on the app service layer or the container?
So I would say if you're really concerned with like what I think people call vendor lock-in, is that's actually something that would be really great as a containerized offering. So I'm not sure exactly what your application is, but if you take that code and package it up into a container, it actually would not take you that long to have that container up and running in each of the 3 clouds. So if that's something that's really important to you, I'd definitely say containerize it, and you can kind of throw it anywhere, which means you can remove it and kind of try the 3 different clouds together and figure out which one you like. However, I do have to say that when we talk to a lot of Fortune 500 companies, like a year ago, 2 years ago, a lot of them were concerned about vendor lock-in, and they would say, like, help me figure out what would be a good way for me to move forward, to be able to kind of move things around. So they containerize things, they use Kubernetes. So Kubernetes is an open source project, right? So each of the different clouds have their own Kubernetes offerings. So a lot of customers move to Kubernetes to be able to say like, oh, if I don't like Azure Kubernetes Service, you can just take their YAML files, which is the configuration files for Kubernetes, and basically deploy that into Google Kubernetes Engine, and it will work basically almost exactly the same way. However, what we've seen is that even though we gave the options to do so for customers, not that many have actually used it. So once they got onto the platform, then they liked it. They didn't see the need to use other clouds and kind of switch over, except for when they want to do kind of that like geo-distributed disaster recovery, so on and so forth. So I would definitely say if you want to have the option, containers is definitely the way to go. And on top of that, or you can also use Kubernetes underneath it. And if you don't want to use Kubernetes underneath it, you can just have a container and throw it into a Azure App Service web app or a Kubernetes cluster if you kind of need that more microservice architecture around that. Yeah.
Hi. On the previous slide, we saw the list of partners, and we also saw the app services available. So here I have a couple of services on the security side, something similar to the Key Vault that you see there.
Yeah.
And also I have services for the developers to have a secure authentication and smart multi-factor. So how can I list my services here? How can I offer?
So that's a great question. So in terms of partnership opportunities, that's really great. Like we actually do work with a lot of different startups on partnership opportunities. Some of the latest ones I want to call out is Twistlock and Aqua, which is actually a like first party partnership with our Azure Container Registry, which is basically what your container registry for your containers that you have in web apps or AKS. So in terms of partnership opportunities, there is a lot, but I would suggest if you look up Azure Marketplace, start there, because if you have your service on Azure Marketplace and you basically get the great benefits of people being able to find your particular service in the Azure portal, and you can kind of show that Azure customers are using it, then all it is kind of reaching out to the product group itself and figure out if you have enough traction. Honestly, we notice it. So I would say, first of all, check out Azure Marketplace and get your startup there.
More questions?
Okay, well, I have a question for you. Do you all feel more comfortable about the Azure services that I talked about? So AKS, functions, app service? Okay, nice. Are you all interested in using any of the things that I've talked about now? Great, awesome. And do you feel like you've learned more about where Azure is thinking about cloud, what we think are the trends that are here to stay? Okay, great. Well, I accomplished the 3 goals I had stated in the beginning of the presentation. So thank you all so much for your time. And definitely stick around for the one-on-one session so you have more in-depth questions. We're here to help, whether you're non-Azure or if you're using it or you're just using a bunch of different things and trying things out. Thank you.